In the spring of 1887, on the high desert outside Silver Junction, eastern Oregon, a 52-year-old ranch hand named Thaddeus Coulter made a choice the town never stopped mocking. He spent his last $75 on 240 acres of waterless desert land ground. Everyone called useless. But what no one in Silver Junction knew was that a starving stallion named Sagefire would stumble out of that same desert before dawn, collapse at Thaddeus's fire, and choose him. And they didn't know that Augusta Bonham, a widowed veterinarian who had stopped believing anything new could still be built, would see what the land and the man had never said aloud. This is their story. A tale of what the world calls worthless, and what endures when someone finally stands. Thaddeus Coulter stood at the counter of the county courthouse while dust tapped against the tall windows like impatient fingers. The room smelled of ink, old paper, and damp wool coats drying too slowly. A ceiling fan turned without much purpose, pushing warm air in lazy circles. The clerk counted out the coins twice, once carefully, then again, slower. $75, the man said, stacking the last coin. He looked up at Thaddeus, then down at the paperwork. 240 acres. That's right. The clerk dipped his pen and hesitated. He lowered his voice, as if the walls themselves might repeat him. You know where this land sits. Thaddeus nodded once. High desert, the clerk continued. Basalt and sage, no surface water. Folks say it doesn't keep things long, men or fences. Thaddeus slid the final coin forward with 2 fingers. I don't need it to keep much. The pen scratched across the page. Thaddeus watched his name take shape, each letter pressed hard enough to dent the paper beneath. When the clerk tore the deed free, Thaddeus folded it carefully, creasing it along existing lines, then slipped it inside his coat and pressed his palm flat over it. Outside, Silver Junction moved with its usual confidence. Boots struck boardwalks. A wagon rattled past. 2 men leaned against the general store posts, coffee steaming in the chill air. That Coulter? One of them asked as Thaddeus crossed the street. Looks like it, the other replied. Man finally bought himself some quiet. Thaddeus swung up onto his mule without answering. He rode out as the town thinned behind him. Houses giving way to scrub, fences to nothing at all. The land opened wide, pale and hard, the wind cutting low and steady. By dusk, he chose a shallow rise and unloaded his gear. The ground resisted his stakes, stone ringing beneath the hammer. When the fire finally caught, it burned small and stubborn, refusing to leap higher than it had to. Thaddeus ate beans from a tin and drank sparingly. As darkness settled, he removed a cracked pocket watch and set it near the firelight. The ticking was uneven but persistent, a sound that held its place against the wind. The canvas snapped once. Thaddeus reached up, tightened a rope, then sat again with his hands open to the heat. I don't know how to keep going, he said, his voice carrying only as far as the fire allowed. The wind answered by shifting direction. Sparks lifted, scattered, and vanished. No house stood waiting. No voice called him back. The land offered nothing. And Thaddeus remained. The wind rose after midnight, low at first, then sharp enough to snap the edge of the canvas. Thaddeus woke fully this time. He sat up, pulled on his coat, and fed the fire until it caught again, the small flames leaning sideways in the wind. He poured coffee into a tin cup and drank it standing, boots plaited wide for balance. The desert beyond the firelight lay flat and unmarked, the kind of darkness that felt deliberate. Thaddeus reached into his coat and took out the cracked pocket watch. He thumbed it open, listening to the uneven ticking, then closed it and slipped it back into his pocket. The wind shifted. A sound followed it, ragged, uneven, wrong. Thaddeus turned his head and waited. The sound came again, closer this time, like breath dragged through dust. He took the lantern and walked beyond the edge of the firelight. the ground crunching under his boots. The sound came from behind a low basalt rise. Thaddeus climbed it slowly, lantern held low, until the light fell across a dark shape in the sand. A stallion staggered forward 2 steps and collapsed. The horse lay on his side, ribs standing out sharp beneath a dull, dirt-caked coat. One eye rolled toward the lantern glow, wide but aware. The animal tried to draw breath and failed once before finding it again. Thaddeus knelt and pressed his palm against the stallion's neck. The pulse there was thin and fluttering, but present. "Easy," Thaddeus said. "You made it." He tipped water along the horse's lips, careful not to rush him. The stallion swallowed once, then twice, then shuddered and went still again. Morning crept in pale and cold. Thaddeus dragged canvas into place for shade and stayed beside the horse, offering water a mouthful at a time, swatting flies away with his hat. The desert remained quiet, watching without interest. By late afternoon, the horse shifted and tried to gather his legs. Thaddeus moved in close, bracing his shoulder until the effort passed. When evening came, Thaddeus rebuilt the fire and leaned against the horse's side. The stallion pressed his weight into the warmth, not trusting, not calm, only choosing heat over cold. Thaddeus rested his hand against the horse's neck. "If you're breathing in the morning," he said, his voice low, "that'll be worth something." The stallion breathed again, steadier than before. The wind eased, just enough to let the fire stand straight, and Thaddeus stayed. Dawn broke thin and colorless. Thaddeus checked the stallion's breathing before he checked the sky. The pulse still worked. The horse's eye opened, then closed again. Slow but aware. Thaddeus stood and stretched, joints stiff from the cold ground. He poured water into a shallow pan and waited. When the stallion licked at it, Thaddeus did not move until the pan was empty. The sun climbed. Heat settled in. Flies gathered and were chased away. Thaddeus tore strips from spare cloth and cleaned the worst of the wounds, careful where the scars ran deep. Rope burns crossed the stallion's flank. Raw places marked where tack had rubbed too long and too hard. "You didn't do this to yourself," Thaddeus said. The stallion's ear flicked once. The desert stayed wide and empty. No riders appeared, no sound carried beyond wind and breath. Thaddeus stood, paced once, then returned to the horse's side. "I don't have grain," he said. "No medicine." The stallion breathed, uneven but steady. "But I can sit here." Near midday, the horse tried to rise and failed. Thaddeus stepped in close, bracing his shoulder against the stallion's chest, boots digging into the sand until the shaking eased. They stayed like that for a long moment. By evening, Thaddeus rebuilt the fire and leaned his back against the stallion's shoulder. The horse shifted and pressed into him, choosing the warmth without hesitation. Thaddeus watched the fire settle into coals. "You walked out of that desert," he said. "Didn't quit." He rested his hand against the horse's neck. "I'll call you Sagefire." The stallion breathed, slow and strong enough now to hear. The land offered no help. It did not soften. It did not explain itself. But it did not take the horse that night either. And when the stars sharpened overhead, Thaddeus remained where he was, firelight on his face, one hand steady against the living weight beside him. Dawn came pale and sharp, light sliding across the hard ground without warmth. Thaddeus knelt beside Sagefire and pressed 2 fingers into the stallion's neck before he looked anywhere else. The pulse answered, thin but steady. "All right," Thaddeus said. "We're moving." He poured water into a shallow pan and waited. Sagefire drank slowly, nostrils flaring. When the pan was empty, Thaddeus stood and shook the stiffness from his legs. He tied spare line into a crude lead, looping it carefully so it wouldn't bite. "Easy now," he said, stepping close. Sagefire tried to rise and failed, knees buckling. Thaddeus moved in fast, bracing his shoulder against the stallion's chest, boots digging into the sand. The horse trembled, then steadied. They stayed like that until the shaking eased. One step came, then another. They moved toward town in slow stages. Stop, breathe, step. The sun climbed higher, bleaching the land pale. Sweat darkened Thaddeus's collar. Sagefire stumbled once, and Thaddeus held him until his legs caught again. By late afternoon, the roofs of Silver Junction appeared ahead. Sound returned with them. Wagon wheels, distant voices. Heads turned as the pair entered town. Conversation slowed. A child stopped playing and stared. Thaddeus did not head for the livery. He turned instead toward a small building near the edge of town where animals were brought when owners had run out of options. The smell of liniment and clean straw drifted through the open door. A woman stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled, gray hair pinned tight. She took in the stallion first, ribs, scars, the way he leaned into the lead, then Thaddeus. "You brought him this far," she said. "He wouldn't make it alone," Thaddeus replied. She stepped closer and ran practiced hands along Sagefire's neck and shoulder. "Neither would you," she said. Thaddeus swallowed. "I don't have money," he said, "but I can work." The woman studied him, eyes steady and measuring. "You're afraid of failing him," she said, "not of owing me." Her name was Augusta Bonham. "Bring him in," she said. The door closed behind them, shutting out the street noise. The stall smelled of clean straw and quiet. Thaddeus loosened his grip on the lead for the first time since dawn. Because now the responsibility had a name, and it wasn't his alone anymore. Augusta worked without hurry, moving around Sagefire with practiced calm. She cleaned the worst of the wounds first, then checked his eyes and gums, listening to his breathing with her ear pressed close to his chest. Thaddeus stood just outside the stall, holding the lead slack but ready. "This didn't happen by accident," Augusta said, rinsing a cloth. "Someone used him hard." Thaddeus nodded. "He didn't come in afraid," he said. "Just empty." Augusta paused at that, then ran her fingers along an old scar where the hair never quite grew back. "That tells me enough," she said. She set the cloth aside and turned to Thaddeus. "He'll need small feedings, clean water, quiet, days before strength." "I can do that," Thaddeus said. "You'll work off the cost," Augusta added. "Fence lines sagging, barrels need hauling, stalls need cleaning. I'll start now." Days settled into rhythm. Thaddeus mended rails while Augusta treated the horse. He hauled water until his shoulders burned and slept in the loft above the barn, where he could hear Sagefire breathe below. By the third day, the stallion ate without trembling. On the fifth, he stood through a full examination without leaning. One evening, Augusta handed Thaddeus a plate of bread and stew. They sat at the small kitchen table under lamplight. Outside, the barn creaked as Sagefire shifted his weight. "My husband died in '79, Augusta said, breaking bread. "Fever." Thaddeus nodded and waited. "I stopped building after that," she said. Thaddeus tore his bread in half. "I've never had ground long enough to build on." Augusta studied him the way she studied animals, looking past posture to what held underneath. "Staying takes practice," she said. From the barn came a solid hoof strike, impatient and strong. Augusta listened, then allowed herself a small nod. "He's getting his weight back." Thaddeus looked toward the sound and did not hide the relief on his face. Outside, the town watched more closely now, and towns rarely watched without deciding something. Silver Junction noticed the change before Thaddeus did. It began with small things. The way conversations paused when he stepped onto the boardwalk, the way eyes lingered longer than they used to. Sagefire's coat had begun to shine. His head carried higher now. That kind of recovery did not stay private in a town that lived by watching one another. Thaddeus crossed the boardwalk and stepped into the general store for grain. The room smelled of flour and leather. A man near the counter leaned close to another and spoke just loudly enough to be heard. "That horse should have died out there," he said. "Desert would have saved everyone the trouble." Another man shifted his weight and answered not unkindly, "But he's still standing." Thaddeus paid for the grain and left without answering. Outside, the voices followed him like dust. "Man buys cursed land," another said. "Brings trouble back with him." Thaddeus loaded the sack onto his mule. His hands moved steadily, practiced. When he turned, Eli Mercer leaned against the hitching rail, smiling without warmth. "Heard you think that stallion belongs to you now," Eli said. Thaddeus met his eyes. "I think he's alive." A few men laughed. One spat into the dirt. Before Thaddeus could move on, a door opened down the street. Augusta Bonham stepped onto the boardwalk, sleeves rolled, eyes level. "This town has plenty of men who enjoy watching things fail," she said. "I won't be one of them." Eli scoffed. "You're risking your standing over a drifter and a half-dead horse." Augusta did not raise her voice. "I'm choosing," she said. "That's different." Silence settled, awkward and unfinished. Thaddeus untied his mule and rode out without looking back. Night fell clean and cold. Thaddeus checked Sagefire's bandages by lantern light. The stallion stood solid now, shifting his weight with purpose. When Thaddeus finished, Sagefire lowered his head and rested it briefly against his shoulder. Thaddeus stilled and set his hand against the horse's neck. Outside the barn, hoofbeats sounded, measured, unhurried, confident. A rider stopped at the fence line and sat watching the barn as if it already belonged to him. The rider dismounted and walked forward, boots clean, posture easy. Thaddeus straightened and turned toward the sound. Because this time, judgment had arrived wearing power. Judson Pike crossed the fence line without asking. His horse was well fed, his tack polished, his coat cut from good cloth. He stopped just short of the barn door and looked past Thaddeus toward the stall. "That stallion shouldn't be here," Judson said. "You're holding property that belongs to me." Sagefire shifted inside the stall, ears flattening. The scars along his flank caught the lantern light like old seams. "He came out of the desert," Thaddeus said. "Collapsed at my fire." Judson smiled thinly. "Then you should have let him die." Augusta stepped out from the barn office, wiping her hands on a cloth. She took in Judson Pike in one measured glance. "You're Victory Pike's son," she said. Judson inclined his head. "The stallion's name is Desert Sovereign," he said. "Worth more than this whole building." Augusta moved closer to the stall and ran her fingers along the brand. She did not hurry. "This mark has been altered," she said. "Burned twice." Judson's smile faded. "You're a veterinarian," he said, "not a judge." "And you're not innocent," Augusta replied. Sagefire stamped once, sharp and loud. Thaddeus stepped closer to the stall door, grounding himself there. "I'll take him now," Judson said, "or I'll have the sheriff here by morning." Augusta reached for her treatment ledger on the shelf and opened it. "You'll need more than that," she said. "Your ranch records didn't vanish as cleanly as you think." Judson's gaze flicked to Thaddeus. "Men like you don't keep things like this," he said quietly. "You don't hold on to them." Thaddeus did not move. "He's alive," he said. "That's enough." Judson stared at him a moment longer, then stepped back. "The law will decide," Judson said. He mounted and rode off without looking back. The barn felt colder once he was gone. Sagefire snorted, uneasy. Augusta closed the ledger. "If he comes back with the law," she said, "we meet him with truth." Thaddeus nodded and stayed where he stood, because stepping aside was no longer an option. Judson Pike did not wait long. The sheriff arrived 2 mornings later, his horse tied careful and straight at the hitching rail. He stepped into the barn with his hat in his hands, eyes already moving over the stalls, the tools, the ledger. Augusta had not bothered to hide. "Morning," he said. "I've had a complaint." Sagefire shifted at the sound of his voice, hooves scraping wood. Thaddeus rested a hand against the stall door, not blocking it, not yielding ground either. The sheriff stepped closer and studied the horse. "That's a fine animal," he said. "Hard used." Augusta nodded. "And recovering." The sheriff looked at her, then measuring. "Mr. Pike claims ownership." "And we claim evidence," Augusta replied, setting the ledger on a nearby crate. The sheriff thumbed through the pages, slow and careful. He asked questions without accusation about brands, about transfers, about dates that did not quite line up. Augusta answered plainly. Thaddeus stood where he was and listened. When the sheriff finished, he closed the book and replaced his hat. "I'll bring this before the court," he said. "Until then, the horse stays put." Judson Pike watched from across the street as the sheriff left. He did not approach the barn. He only stood there, hands clasped behind his back, studying the doors as if memorizing them. The town noticed that too. By afternoon, people found reasons to pass the clinic. Some slowed their horses. Some stopped outright. "You're going to lose that fight," one man said quietly to Thaddeus. "Maybe," Thaddeus replied. That night, Augusta spread papers across her kitchen table. Breeding logs, shipping receipts, veterinary notes with dates written firm and clear. Lamplight shook with the wind. "He hit him," Augusta said, "moved him without record." Thaddeus set his cracked pocket watch beside the papers. The ticking filled the quiet. "What if it's not enough?" he asked. Augusta met his eyes. "Then we stand anyway." Outside, Sagefire stamped once in the stall, impatient, strong. The courthouse bell rang in the distance, marking the hour, and the town leaned closer, ready to see who would bend first. The days before the hearing moved with careful tension. Thaddeus and Augusta rode out early and returned late, dust settling on their coats like proof of distance traveled. They did not announce their purpose. They asked questions and waited. At a ranch north of town, an older hand leaned on a fence rail and watched Thaddeus approach. "You're the one with Pike's horse," the man said. "He came to me," Thaddeus replied. The man spat into the dirt. "They ran him till he bled. Pike wanted foals, not horses." He paused, eyes on the stallion in the distance. "Didn't think he'd last," he added, "but he's still standing." Augusta wrote the words down without comment. At another place, a former stable boy hesitated in a doorway, eyes flicking toward the road. "They told us not to speak," he said it would pass. "It won't," Augusta said. The boy swallowed and spoke anyway. By evening, papers lay stacked on the clinic table. Shipping receipts, altered breeding logs, names that lined up too cleanly to be coincidence. Thaddeus stood near the window, watching the last light fade from the street. Augusta tapped one page. "This puts the horse on a transfer list months after the ranch closed," she said. "But he never left the valley." Thaddeus nodded. "Because he was hidden." Night settled. Thaddeus stayed in the barn with Sagefire, brushing the stallion's coat until it shone dull gold in the lantern light. Sagefire stood patient and solid now, no longer leaning. Thaddeus tightened a strap, then loosened it again, checking the fit. Sagefire turned his head and breathed warm air against Thaddeus's sleeve. Augusta appeared at the stall door. "You'll stand tomorrow," she said. Thaddeus latched the stall and checked the chain twice. "I will." Outside, clouds gathered thin and high, rare in that country. The air smelled of dust and coming weather. Thaddeus rested his hand against Sagefire's neck and stayed there. Because tomorrow would not be decided by silence. It would be decided by who remained standing when it counted. The courthouse filled before the bell finished ringing. Boots scuffed the floorboards. Dust drifted through the tall windows and settled on shoulders and hats. The room smelled of sweat, ink, and damp wool. People took their seats early, not wanting to miss the moment when the story would turn. Judson Pike sat near the front, coat clean, posture easy. He spoke quietly to his lawyer and did not look back. Thaddeus entered with Augusta beside him. He removed his hat and stood until the judge took the bench. When he sat, he kept the hat folded in his hands. Judson's lawyer rose first, his voice smooth and practiced. He spoke of ownership and loss, of a valuable stallion taken by a man who had no right to keep him. He gestured once toward Thaddeus without naming him. When Thaddeus was called, the room shifted. He walked to the stand and stood still, his hands resting on the rail. "You're a hired man," the lawyer said. "Isn't that right?" "Yes." "And you expect this court to believe a stallion worth more than your land simply wandered into your care?" "He collapsed at my fire," Thaddeus said. "He was dying." The lawyer leaned closer. "And that made him yours?" Thaddeus shook his head. "It made him alive." A murmur passed through the room. Augusta followed. She laid the evidence out piece by piece, brands altered, dates changed, injuries explained. She spoke plainly, without heat, as if describing the weather. The lawyer tried again. "You've grown attached," he said. Augusta met his eyes. "I've grown accurate." Judson stood then, breaking decorum. "You're siding with nobody," he said sharply. "A man with nothing." Augusta turned toward him. "I'm siding with what lasts," she said, "not what exploits." The judge called for order and bent over the papers. Silence stretched. No one moved. When the ruling came, it was simple and final. The horse remained with Thaddeus Coulter. Thaddeus did not move at first. Then he reached for Augusta's hand. She took it without looking down. The gavel struck once more, and the room had to accept that the quiet man had stayed where he stood. The courthouse doors opened and let afternoon light spill across the floor. People stood slowly, voices rising as if unsure what to do with the ending they had been given. Judson Pike left first, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed ahead. No one followed him. A man near the courthouse steps muttered Pike's name, then shook his head. Another turned away outright. By the time Pike reached the street, the space around him had opened, not in respect, but in refusal. Thaddeus stepped outside with Augusta beside him. The street felt altered, not welcoming, not hostile, adjusting. An older rancher named Hollis Keene cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Coulter," he said, "didn't think you'd win." Thaddeus nodded. "Neither did I." Hollis shifted his weight. "If you're fencing that land of yours, I've got posts you can have. Been sitting too long." Another man offered scrap lumber. A woman pressed a sack of grain into Thaddeus's hands without meeting his eyes. No one apologized. They simply corrected course the only way they knew how. Augusta watched it happen, her expression held in careful reserve. "They follow proof," she said quietly. "Proof lasts," Thaddeus replied. As they turned toward the street, someone behind them said it, not loud, not proud, just stating a fact. "He's still standing." Sagefire stood waiting in the barn, head high, ears alert. Thaddeus opened the stall and ran a hand along the stallion's neck. Sagefire leaned into it, solid and sure. "That part's finished," Thaddeus said. Augusta shook her head slightly. "The fight ended," she said. "Life's still starting." Thaddeus hesitated, then nodded toward the west. "Come see the land," he said. "I could use another set of eyes." Augusta studied him for a moment, then stepped up beside him. "All right," she said. "I'll see it." They rode out as the sun dropped low, the town behind them quieter than it had ever been, because judgment had spoken. And now the land would answer. Summer settled hard on the high desert. Heat pressed down without apology, bleaching the land pale and driving everything living toward shade and patience. Thaddeus worked from first light until the sun stood too high to argue with. Fence posts went in one by one, stone ringing beneath the hammer. A rough shelter rose beside the rise where his first fire had burned, boards replaced slowly as better ones could be spared. Augusta came often. Sometimes she brought supplies. Sometimes she brought nothing at all. She walked the land with measured steps, studying slope and stone, kneeling to sift dirt through her fingers. "It's not dead ground," she said one afternoon, standing and brushing her hands clean. "It's sealed." They dug where she marked. The ground fought them with basalt and dust. Days passed. Sweat darkened shirts. Thaddeus drank sparingly and kept swinging. A driller named Thomas Avery rode out one morning, hat tipped low, eyes already reading the land. He studied the rock, the lay of the scrub, the shallow draws that hinted at something held back. "There's a chance," Avery said. "No promise." Thaddeus looked to Augusta. She gave a small nod. The drill arrived days later, loud enough to carry for miles. It bit into the earth with a sound that shook the ground beneath their feet. Dust rose. Stone cracked. Hours passed under the sun. Augusta shaded her eyes and watched the drill head sink lower. Near dusk, the sound changed. A deeper note. A hollow answer. Water surged up, clear and cold, spilling into the trough they'd dug. For a moment, no one spoke. The desert seemed to hold its breath. Thaddeus knelt and let the water run over his hands. Augusta stepped forward, then stopped. Her hand hovered above the stream, fingers trembling once before she lowered them into the flow. She drew them back slowly, wet palms pressed together as if grounding herself. "It was here," she said. That night, firelight danced beside the new well. Sagefire stood at the edge, head lowered, drinking without hurry. Thaddeus watched him, then turned to Augusta. "Build here," he said. "With me." Augusta looked across the dark land, listened to water move where none had before. She took his hand. "Yes," she said. Years passed. Grass took hold where scrub had ruled. Foals ran across the pasture, Sagefires lined, finding good hands up and down the basin. Thaddeus and Augusta stood together at dusk, watching the land hold. The fire burned low. The water kept moving. And the truth carried forward, steady as breath. What is chosen late can still endure.